In 2021, a group of snowboarders and skiers inadvertently stumbled on a grizzly bear den in Haines, Alaska. It was February, a time when bears are normally hibernating and you don't expect to see them. The groggy bear awoke as the group skied right over her den. What followed was a determined mother bear who was going to protect her cub at all costs. This is a story of Bart Pichuel. Bart Pichuel was born and raised in Poland, but once he saw a snowboard movie that featured the Haines Mountains, he knew that he wanted to move there and live there because he was just so obsessed with snowboarding. And Haines is beautiful. It's got huge mountains, it's got the ocean, it's really got everything. Wild nature, it's a small little town, and it's just a beautiful, one of my favorite places to go. So his family and friends thought he was a little bit nuts because he was this European guy who wanted to go live in the wilds of Alaska. But it was his dream and it was a life that he wanted. So he moved to Alaska in Haines in 2013, and he worked as a chef, a fisherman, and a carpenter. In 2021, Bart and his two ski partners, Jeff, Graham, and a dog named Surku, headed to the mountains. It was one of those amazing bluebird winter days in February. It's one that you want to take advantage of because it's sunny and they live on the coast, so it's not always sunny. And it was getting warm, the daylight was slowly returning, so they really wanted to take advantage of it. And the plan was to head up above Chilkoot Lake and go skiing. So they were all familiar with this area and they'd traveled it many times before. The group was super experienced in the outdoors, and between them they had just had this massive wealth of local mountain knowledge. Graham is a former alpine racer who lives in a treehouse he built with his wife. And Jeff had been involved in avalanche and rescue training for more than a decade. And Bart knew all the ski lines in Haines. He'd been out a ton of times in the backcountry because he just loved it. They'd each spent hundreds of days in the backcountry. So by early afternoon, the group was skinning up a forested ridgeline. Graham was leading and just out of sight of the other two. After they skinned up about 1,500 feet, the route just became too icy for their climbing skins. So Bart and Jeff strapped their boards to their backs and began hiking their steps. They were post-holing through several inches of powder because there was this hard, slippery base underneath it. So they were kind of slipping along as they went. And then they kept slogging along for a while, trying to get as high as they could so they could have that longer downhill run. Then Bart saw a cute little porcupine pop out of the snow about 15 meters or 50 feet away. But the porcupine, it was odd. It kind of just kept growing, and then it grew into this massive size as it just started clawing its way out of the snow. And that's when Bart realized what it was. He yelled, "Bear, bear, bear," and Jeff looked to see this massive brown fur heading towards Bart. They had hiked directly over top of the den without knowing it. And the bear was initially awkward and stiff, its head was swaying, and it was walking as if it just had no coordination. Because bears don't wake from hibernation with like a spring in their step, they're groggy and they're kind of in a state of walking hibernation for a couple of weeks. And so the bear was wobbling its way towards Bart and slowly focused its gaze on the shocked man. The bear proceeded slowly, plodding towards him. Bart waved his arms and spoke to the bear, a recommended practice from bear experts to kind of show the bear that you're intimidating. As he backed up through the trees, Bart caught a quick glimpse of a second smaller bear emerging from the den. He realized that a sow with a cub in a den was one of the worst possible scenarios for a bear encounter. Jeff was about 9 meters or 30 feet away and watched in absolute horror as his friend faced off with this bear. He was so far away he couldn't do anything. Now Bart was a good-sized guy. He was 6'2", 200 pounds, but when that bear lunged, it just grabbed him by the wrist and just shook him like a rag doll. She threw him into the air with her powerful jaws like it was nothing. And shortly after the attack started, the bear and Bart started sliding downhill. The slippery slope had caused them to go rocketing down the hill together for about 100 feet. Then they slowed to a stop, and Bart immediately felt a huge pressure on his body as the bear grabbed the left side of his neck, and that's when he began to play dead. She bit him on the butt, the arm, above his right hip, and he managed to lay really quietly, making as little movement and noise as possible, which was probably really hard to do. He knew the bear was just protecting her cubs, and he had a feeling that it was just going to subdue him, and then he was hoping that it would be on its way after that. And much to his relief, it actually worked. The bear stopped the attack and left him alone. She had neutralized that threat to the cub, and then she retreated to be with her cub. So Bart just laid there in the snow, trying not to think about his massive injuries, the medical bills, or the fact that his mountain adventures may not continue. Jeff and Graham saw that initial attack until the bear and Bart went sliding down the hill, and then they were out of sight. So they had no idea what happened after that. So Graham strapped on his helmet and skied down to get Bart. Jeff was frantically putting on his skis as he saw Graham zip by him. Jeff's heart was absolutely pounding. He feared the worst. He wasn't sure if his friend was alive or dead. Graham said, "I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I thought if the bear was still on Bart, I'd try to distract it and hope to outski it." He followed a trail of blood and broken ski poles and then found Bart curled up in a ball. He was absolutely motionless, but there was no bear in sight, which was good, but blood was just spilling out onto the snow. They stared in shock at their wounded friend. This was just unbelievable. Jeff prides himself on being prepared for anything, but a bear encounter is kind of the last of your worries when it's the middle of winter and you live in a place like Alaska and you don't expect to see bears roaming around. And the chances of wandering on top of one of their dens is just 1 in a million, probably. Graham yelled at Jeff to call for help. Jeff's hand was shaking as he hit the SOS button, which would send a distress call and GPS coordinates for their location. He then sent a text to his girlfriend saying, "Bart's been mauled by a bear and we need help right away." The inReach doesn't have voice calling capability. They can only send and receive text through devices that they've been paired with. So his girlfriend was essentially their lifeline. Bart's injured hand was laying uselessly by his side and he was really worried about it. There was an open fracture and he couldn't move his fingers. He told Jeff and Graham that he thought he was going to lose his hand. But even though he was injured, they were really relieved to hear him speak at all. Then Bart, with his wide and unfocused eyes, stared into Jeff's eyes and told him that if he died, what his social security number was, his mother's phone number, and where to locate his computer passwords. Jeff started to panic because he thought, oh my God, is he going to die? He told Bart that it was going to be okay, that he wasn't going to die, but he wasn't even sure himself. They were worried about internal bleeding, and they couldn't tell if he was bleeding internally or not, and help was going to be a while, so they weren't sure that he was going to make it if he did have internal bleeding. Bart ignored him and told Jeff to tell his mom that he loved her. So Bart was complaining about bite wounds across his body, including one that was really close to his femoral artery. It was minus 12 Celsius or 10 Fahrenheit out, and they realized that the cold was almost as much of a threat as his injuries. Luckily, Jeff, he was always prepared. Even though they didn't expect this to happen, he had a ton of extra equipment, and he just started pulling item after item out of his backpack. Graham joked that it was like a clown car, things just kept coming out and coming out. Just when you thought nothing else could come out, more stuff came out. So he had plenty of down layers, a thermos of warm water, first aid kit, a space blanket, sleeping pad, and a bivy sack. So man, was that guy prepared or what? So they made a splint from Bart's backpack for his broken arm and assessed his bleeding. And then they just focused on keeping him as warm as they could. They cuddled against Bart to keep him warm and just waited for rescue. As they worked to keep him warm, Circu, the dog, raised her nose to sniff the air. They weren't sure if the bear would return or if the cub was in the nearby den. They just had no idea, so they just kept banging their ski poles and making lots of noise to scare the bear away if it was coming back. Meanwhile, Bart was getting colder and colder, but he was staying positive at this time. Graham said the first half hour was the most stressful, just wondering if he was going to stay alive. And once it became clear that he wasn't going to die, they said that they just started telling stories to try to keep it positive and keep him comfortable. The U.S. Coast Guard helicopter finally reached the group 3 hours after the attack. Bart was close to hypothermic. He had deep puncture wounds to his neck, legs, butt, and arms, but he was conscious and alive. He was even able to help himself get into the rescue basket before it was lifted up into the helicopter. He was taken to a hospital in Juneau where they were able to save his life and his hand. The co-pilot of the helicopter said the other 2 members in the patient's skiing party had the proper equipment and knowledge to assist with his injuries and communicate for help in cold temperatures with sunset approaching. Their satellite communication device provided the precise GPS coordinates and elevation of their location. Equally important, they had bright-colored fabric to signal the helicopter as we approached, and this was absolutely crucial to us finding them in a timely manner. All 3 men felt the same way after the incident. They know that they lived in a wild place, it's untamed, and they like it that way. The element of chance was a huge factor in this incident. None of them had done anything wrong. There wasn't one stupid mistake. It just happened, a really rare event. And Bart didn't want anything to happen to the bear. She was defensive, but never aggressive. And as a result, wildlife officers decided not to track her down. An Alaska fish and game biologist said that it's a common misconception that bears sleep all winter long. They go into a state of torpor, and that's not the same as true hibernation, like ground squirrels, for example. Those little guys, which I have all over the place over here, they are like practically dead for up here for 6 to 8 months out of the year. Their body temperature just drops really low, almost to freezing, and their heart rate really dies down, and they just don't move at all for the whole winter. But bears aren't like that. They can get lethargic and stay in the den all winter, but other times they might exit the den for a little bit and then go back inside. But as we learned in this story, they're definitely capable of being disturbed while hibernating. And Bart later said that it's people who intrude on the bears, not them on us. We have to find a way to coexist. And Bart doesn't really talk much about the attack. He doesn't really want to sensationalize it because often that turns into a free-for-all against the bears. It's those times when you surprise them, and especially a mother with a cub or a grizzly with a recent kill. Those are the ones that are going to be angry. I live out here and I had a grizzly bear just come walking right down, just kind of wandered through my meadow here. And all it did was sniff around, and it was huge. I'm not just saying that, it was the biggest grizzly I've ever seen in my life. And it was massive. And it just kind of wandered around, it went down here, it rolled in the meadow, came back up, sniffed around the cabin a little bit. I was making noise, banging around, and then it just wandered off on its own. So anyways, I like to talk about how prepared those guys were, because that's one thing worth remembering about this story is all the stuff they had ready to go when Bart was injured, the satellite phone that they had, all the stuff that he had in his backpack, the colored clothing, you know, the bivy sack, the first aid kit. I bring it to my channel to show how being uber prepared in any situation is always a good thing. If they didn't have that inReach or all that extra clothing to keep Bart warm, who knows what might have happened. You know, they had those few hours to wait, and it could have been longer, you never know. So luckily they were prepared. In the end, Bart says that the encounter had changed him, but he didn't want it to define him. And he returned to the mountains as fast as he could and continues to explore the mountains to this day.